Now, if you were not here last night, the handouts for last night are available on this table down at the end here, so make sure you pick up some of those handouts for last night. And for those of you who are joining us online, and there are quite a few folks joining us online, we appreciate you connecting with us. And you may be thinking, I wish I could have those handouts. Well, we've had someone who has volunteered to turn these paper copies into PDF files, and we are going to work on getting those available. So at some point later on, please come back to the page wherever you're watching, either on Facebook or YouTube, and we will have a link for you to be able to go and get those handouts on a PDF file. So they won't be available immediately, but check back in a day or two, and we'll make sure we get those up there. And we appreciate you being with us online as well. And let other folks know about it. Send the link to someone else so that they can benefit from this as well. But we appreciate those of you who are here in person today. We enjoy getting to meet you. Those of you who are guests get to fellowship together. And we appreciate Don introduced him last night, so I won't take up any more of his time to do that right now. But we do want to begin with a prayer, and Brother David Hall is going to get us started.
Would you bow with me? Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful day you blessed us with, Father, for the sunshine we woke up to this morning and all the blessings that you shower us with each and every day. We thank you for it, acknowledge that they come from you. Father, we thank you for bringing Don and Lisa our way. Father, we thank you for the abilities. We thank you for the wisdom and the knowledge that you have blessed Don with in this subject, and we thank you for his willingness to come and share with us, Father, the things that he knows and has learned about grief and loss. Father, we continue to pray for those who are struggling at this time with going through times of grief, times of loss, and we again just ask you to be with them and to bless them in ways that you know best. Father, above all things this morning, we want to thank you for Jesus, for his love for us and leaving his home in heaven to come down to this earth to give his life for us. We thank you for the home that you prepared for us in heaven one day. And it's through his loving and precious name that we pray. Amen.
Good morning. Thank you so much for choosing to be here today. There are many other places that you could have been. It's a beautiful day. I'm sure there's a lot of yard work that you could be doing, but you chose to be here. And for that, we are grateful. And we hope that what we will say will be of some help to you, and that we solicit your participation in this. You may have to speak up a little louder, but love for you to make comments accordingly, and I hope that what we'll say will be of some help. I want to read something that somebody wrote called Falling Apart, which may or may not describe your situation. I seem to be falling apart. My attention span can be measured in seconds, my patience in minutes. I cry at the drop of a hat. I forget things constantly. The morning toast burns daily. I forget to sign the checks. Half of everything in the house is misplaced. Anxiety and restlessness are my constant companions. Rainy days seem extra dreary. Sunny days seem an outrage. Other people's pain and frustration seem insignificant. Laughing, happy people seem out of place in my world. It's become routine to feel half crazy. I am normal, I am told. I'm a newly grieving person. Perhaps you can identify with some of those feelings, and so if that is the case, then perhaps something we can say today will be of some help to you. Now, having said all that, let's take a test. So look at what do you know about grief and loss. This comes from a book by Therese Rondeau, How to Go On Living When Someone You Love Dies. It's an excellent book. And we'd like sort of to have this as a way of beginning our discussion this morning. These are true or false statements. Number one, it normally takes 1 year to get over your grief. False. What are the things wrong with that statement? When you look at it, what stands out to you? getting over, because as we said, you're not going to get over grief. You're going to go through it, hopefully grow through it, but you're not going to get over it. You can't get around it. It's going to be there. Remember the simple equation that we mentioned last night. Love plus loss equals grief. I love someone or something. I lose someone or something. Grief is normal. It's going to be a part of it. Do you know that the first word or place in the Bible that was used by grief is used by God? Genesis chapter 6. It grieved God that he had made mankind because of the ills and because of the sins in their lives. And so God is a God of emotion and knew something about grief. How did he describe his son? Isaiah 53. A man of sorrows, verse 3, acquainted with grief. So, yes, sir.
Intuitively, it would seem that if you plotted that on a chart, that the greater the love, then the steeper or greater the increase in grief.
That's a good point, that the greater the love, then also the greater the grief in that manner. Because, I'm not going to be sorry over something that really didn't affect me. Right, or be saddened by it. But if there is, I just met a good gentleman, and he talked about his relationship with his wife for 58 years. That's just, what do we have comparatively that affects us for 58 years? We don't. And so when somebody says, well, it just hurts so bad, well, look at the enormous hole that has been placed because of that situation and because of that loss. So first of all, normal, and then secondly, time frame, 1 year. Nobody in their right minds, even with the books that I've read, have ever given a time frame for a length of a loss.
I don't think you ever get over it. You just learn to live with it.
Okay.
It gets easier as time goes.
Okay. And for the sake of those live streaming, I'll try to re-say what you have said, but you don't get over it. You learn to live with it is what you're trying to say. With time. And so what you do with your time, that certainly enters into that. But no time frame, and then this idea of getting over. Yet sometimes well-meaning friends will say to you, it's been 9 months. Shouldn't you be over that by now? Again, 1 out of 5 people who typically talk to you about your grief journey, 1 out of every 5 only knows something about your loss. In other words, they've had losses as well. So typically 4 out of 5 don't really know anything about your feelings because they haven't felt it themselves. And so sometimes you just might have to think, this is one of those 5 because they sometimes may say the wrong things. Number 2, all bereaved people grieve in the same way. False. Even if, let's say you lost a parent and there are sibling groups, brothers and sisters, even in that situation, you're going to grieve differently. Why? Because you're a different person. One daughter may have lived next door to the parents. Another daughter may have lived in Michigan, didn't get to come nearly as much. It doesn't matter. One may have lived across the road or maybe, somewhere else in Prattville. It doesn't matter. Everybody looks at grief with a lot of commonalities, but there's also some differences. And so sometimes we have to understand those differences in that manner. Mary Steiner Rice put it this way: grief is a solitary journey. No one but you can know how great the hurt is. No one but you can know the gaping hole left in your life when someone you love has died. And no one but you can mourn the silence that was once filled with laughter and song. It is the nature of love and of death to touch every person in a totally unique way. Comfort does come from knowing that other people have made the same journey, and solace comes from understanding how others have learned to sing again. But we just need to understand that people are going to do it differently. Number 3, children grieve in ways that are different than adults. Very true. Children are sometimes referred to as the forgotten grievers. 45% of children often hear about or learn about the death of somebody significant to us because they hear adults whispering about it over in the corner. Here's the rule of thumb as a child or a grandchild or even a great-grandchild. If you are old enough to love, you are old enough to mourn. Now think about that. Can a 3-year-old love? Sure they can. Well, they're going to mourn. They're going to grieve. Now, they're not going to be able to do it like us because they don't have that mental capacity. With us, grief is 24/7, right? We think about it throughout the day. It goes to bed with us at night. Sometimes we may even dream about our deceased. Hospice did a study and found out that 1 out of 5 thought that they literally had seen their loved one sometime after the death. Maybe going down the road and all of a sudden there they were, especially if the loss was sudden and unexpected, or if the loss was a situation where the body had not or could not be recovered. We had a neighbor that was a part of 9/11, literally in the first tower. Thankfully, she got out. But, some 3,000 did not. Think about those folks with the thought that they still, so many years removed, but still wondering, are they just wandering around the streets somewhere in some other state or city? Because the body was never recovered. A drowning situation. Other situations where there is not a body to reclaim. All that goes along with it. Children do grieve. Yes. How long should a person grieve? The answer is this: you're going to grieve as long as you live. Now, in differing states, different ways, but the younger you are, the more likely you're going to have longer to grieve. I mean, just think about it. Because you feel the void of that loss and that impact. Imagine someone who is 29 and loses a mother at the age of 49. They're going to have a lot of years to feel the void of that mother, that grandmother, not being able to be a part of their life. As opposed to someone 75 or 80, because we know that we're not going to, live 30 more years probably. So we just understand that. So a person will grieve in differing ways, maybe in smaller amounts as they begin to work through it. But a person is going to grieve, and children are going to grieve as well. I did a funeral many years ago for a 46-year-old mother who on a Friday night when school was starting had gone out with her children, with her husband to buy supplies for school, kissed her 2 boys goodnight, went to sleep in the bed and never woke up. Found out that she had a heart defect, they found later on. But she had died in her sleep, literally. Because that boy was on the basketball team that I helped coach, they asked me to do the funeral. There was also a church connection there where I preached. And I had never seen a 10-year-old literally wailing until the day of that funeral. They literally had to carry him out of the funeral home, because he was so hurt and so sad over the death of his mom, and rightly so. Drove from there, Loretta, Tennessee, down to Center Hill, which is in Killen, Alabama, 15 minutes away, 20 tops. And as I pull up to the cemetery where the body is going to be buried, that same boy that they literally had carried out of the funeral home is out there kicking rocks with his cousins. And I sort of did a double take. I thought, wait a minute, is that the same boy? And then it hit me. His capacity to grieve is over for right now. He's going to go back and do what boys do, play with rocks or throw things around. Does he still feel the void? Yes. But he doesn't have the capacity just to carry it from where it was to where he is now. And so children do grieve, and we need to understand that. And we need to know that they too need to be included in funeral situations. There was a matriarch of this family. She was a school teacher there in the area, taught school at Rogers School, the local school. And she had 6 children and her husband, and she had died, and they asked me to do the funeral. And so, like Brent does, I'm sure, I wanted to meet with the family to see if there was something special that we could say about them, something that they would like for me to allow the people to know about this good lady. And so there were the 6 children, their mates, and the husband. And we were in a music room there in the back of the Loretta Funeral Home. Now, if you know anything about that area, they say Loretta instead of, it looks like Loretto, but it's really, that's not what they say. So we're back there, and so we talk. And after we talked for a period of time, then I said, can I meet with your children? Yes, we want you to. There were 18 of those grandkids from age 5 to 24. And they were in that same music room after the parents had left. And I just asked the question, what would you like folks to know about your grandmother? You should have heard everything they were talking about. I mean, every one of them had something to say. But the story that kept on coming up was the day in which they had been in the golf cart with Grandma, and she was out there in the pasture, and it had overheated and caught on fire. And they said, you should have seen our grandmother. She was throwing us off that thing right and left. Then she went over and she dug in the earth and she grabbed dirt and began to throw it, and she put the fire out. Guess what story I told at the funeral? Because it wasn't how she died, but how she lived that was so important. And that's what people need to know. Some way to lift up the names of people. Over in Corinth, Mississippi, we did a grief workshop, and there was a lady that told the story of her husband that died rural suddenly. And she said, our children, ages 12 and 14, were able to speak at his funeral, which was amazing and beautiful that it happened. And she said, a year later, my 15-year-old daughter was eating pizza with some of her friends. And so they went to the local pizza place and they bought pizza. And instead of eating it there, they went out to the cemetery, sat around the tombstone, and ate pizza as they talked about her dad. And as they left a piece of pizza there on the tombstone. Children have a way of lifting up and working through grief that's so, so very important. But it's very important that they be included. Just last week in Benton, Kentucky, during one of the breaks, a lady in her 80s came up to me and talked about the death of her 24-year-old brother. She was much younger, but she said, my brother looked after me. He was always there for me. He protected me. Even whenever he had a date, he would also make sure that I was taken care of. And so he had a car wreck and got into a coma. And I wanted to go and visit him in the hospital, but my mom would not allow me to do so. She wanted me to go into school. And she said, I wanted to go especially because he wasn't a Christian. And I just wanted to say what I could to him, but I wasn't allowed to, and he died. And she said, I got to go to the funeral, but it was so heartache that I was not able to be a part of that situation. And then my daddy had fallen out of the church, and I was afraid that he too was going to die. And so I told my mother my concerns, and she said, "You go and tell him what you're thinking." And so she did. And in time, her father was restored. This lady was telling me this story while tears were in her eyes. It had happened over 50 years ago, and yet here was the impact of a child, if you will, a teenager, not able to participate in those last moments with her beloved brother that really, really was hurting her 50 years removed. So it's important. And tomorrow, somewhere down this way, Lisa will be teaching a class to adults concerning how to help your children and grandchildren grieve in a proper way. And so that's something that's important. Again, the rule of thumb, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn. Number 4, holidays and anniversaries of death or losses give off great amounts of anguish and pain. Very true. If you're looking at the holidays for the very, very first time, be good to yourself. Feel what you feel. Do what you need to do to get through the holidays. They may not be the best time this first year, but do what you need to do to try to make it the very best you can. Over in the book, Walking with Those Who Weep, there's a chapter that deals with grief in the holidays, and you might want to take a look at that. But 8 million people every year look at the holidays without their loved one physically present. Millions of others wish that the calendar would stick from November 1st to January 2nd because of those 2 holidays that are in there. And so we just need to understand that. Number 5, the threat of divorce is a real probability after a child dies. Here's the key word, probability. Possibility, yes. Can the loss of a child hurt a marriage? Possibly. But probability, let me just put it this way. In Nashville, Tennessee, and in Birmingham, and probably Atlanta and other major cities like that, you will find the Compassionate Friends. They are a national organization that deals with 2 kinds of losses: the loss of a child of any age and the loss of siblings. They did a study some years ago asking 600 bereaved parents what the marital situation in their life was years removed from the death of their child. Here's what they found out. 74% of them, 3 out of 4, were still married. 14% were widowed. They had lost their mate some years after the loss of the child. 12% only had divorced. And of the 12% that had divorced, only 3% said that the death of the child had anything to do with the death of the marriage. They did this study about 10 years later and found out basically the same statistics. Only 12 to 16% had divorced. So, if a person doesn't have the best of marriage, the loss of the child can certainly hurt it. But in some cases, if people can work together and try to mend themselves and grow closer to themselves, it doesn't have to be a reality. There's a little book by Martha Biddle Clark. If you could find it, it would be an excellent read. Biddle, B-I-T-T-L-E. Are You Weeping With Me, God? Small book, but very, very interesting, in which she talks about the death of their 21-year-old daughter that was killed in a car wreck on her home from North Carolina. She said that after the funeral, her husband eventually would go back to work, and he'd work all day long, and he'd come in, and they would have supper and not say a whole lot to each other, but talk maybe a little small talk. And then he'd go to the recliner and take a little nap, and then afterwards they go to bed, and they weren't ever talking about their daughter. And she said, meanwhile, throughout the day, I was grieving. I was crying my face off, if you know what I mean. And she said, I was dealing with all this alone, and yet he would come home and never talk about our daughter and how important she was in our lives and what we're going to do about it. And she began to wonder. And she wrote an autobiography to God. God, where are you in all this? And why is my husband? And so she's writing these statements to God and talking to her preacher. One day she went to his office. He had an office inside another office. And so from the outside, she could look in and she saw her husband with all the pictures of their daughter around him at the table, at the desk. And his head was on the desk and he was crying his eyes out. And she said, here is where he's grieving. At home, he's trying to be strong. He's trying to keep a stiff upper lip. He's trying not to hurt me. And yet here is where he's vulnerable. And so they had to have a big talk, a come to Jesus meeting, if you know what I mean. And realize that they were hurting their relationship because what was common to them, this child that had been conceived in love, they needed to talk about the impact on each of their lives and on their lives collectively. So it doesn't have to be the case that divorce takes place. It is a possibility, but it doesn't have to be a probability. Any questions or any comments concerning that or anything else we've mentioned so far? Yes.
One of the things that brings up, and the number 2 question there, all people grieve the same way. Isn't it true that grieving is personal, and like so much in life, we don't need to be judging others, even close to us, about how they grieve and expect them to grieve by our standards or to get over it by our standards.
Good point. Yes. Every grief is unique. Even in the same family, it's going to be unique. There will be commonalities, but there are also going to be differences. And there's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stage situation because there's phases. And as we'll look at in just a moment, it's a tangled ball of emotions. And so for us to think, well, you're not grieving the way, wait a minute, there's no book that tells you how to grieve. You grieve the best way that you can. Certainly we don't want to be destructive to ourselves or hurtful to ourselves. But at the same time, we can't say, well, I don't see them crying, so they must not be sorrowful. Well, again, that's a judgment that we don't need to make. First of all, some people may not have tear ducts to allow them to cry. Secondly, they may be holding up their composure around you because tears may make you sad, and they're trying to be that way. Or they may believe that that's what you think. And so, to Brother David here, I need to be strong and brave and everything's good and whatever because that's what I may think he expects of me, even though that shouldn't be the way it is. But, I'm fine. We talked about that last night. Well, we're really not.
How should parents?
Sir?
How should parents?
I'm sorry.
How should parents?
How should
Parent their child that is breathing real hard and reveal that they could turn back to the Lord and see whether it's right for them or somewhere else. But how do we coach that child to bring from the graveyard back to Christ?
That's a tough question, and that is when the person, because of their grief, has fallen away from Christ or whatever. We have to live the example before them of what a Christian is, and even with the loss and the pain that we have, the hope that we have for those who are faithful in Christ, that die in the Lord. And so we need to try to do that. It's harder sometimes, especially when some people don't see it that way and don't see the need to be able to do that. The Bible says to weep, but not as those who have no hope, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And so to show sadness is part of grief. It's certainly proper to do that. At the same time, the impact that the church, your family can have is something that we just can't live without. And that's so important. And when sometimes people don't have that, if they will see the love that people give to you over the loss of your loved one, then hopefully they're going to want that as well, because I just don't see how a person can get through grief without the help of their church family. I mean, 1 Corinthians 12 talking about, if one member suffer, all the members suffer with it. If one member be honored, verse 25, all the members rejoice with it. God said that. I wouldn't want to think about having to deal with a loss without somebody to fall back to. And I think most of you understand that. And that's certainly the hope. Yes, sir.
Just back to one thing, for everybody, grief, one thing I was talking to last night, mentioned, I was looking, some of these live homicide programs that show actual homicides, they go out. And I've noticed several times on it, particularly a family member, a parent, husband, wife, whatever, who was killed by homicide, and they'll come and tell the person, they'll see their reaction, and if they're not just blowing their head off, something must be wrong. Let's put them on our suspect list. Maybe they did something. They've got the thing like everybody should be acting the same way when they're dead, when they're homicide.
Right.
And I said, that just makes sense.
That's true. And what people may not realize is that person may be in shock, which is very much a part of the body makeup. Whenever trauma comes our way, we go into that shock mode, and because that's part of us, and especially when we receive news of an unexpected nature, that just really, really, really does make it hard. Let's go down to number 6. This is sort of what we talked about some last night, and I'd like to mention it a little bit more now. Losing someone to sudden death is the same as losing someone to an anticipated death. The answer is false. Not to say that one is greater than the other, but one is different than the other. Because intellectually, we may see the demise of a person that is in the process of slipping away, of dying. If they're in the hospital, we can look at the machines and see the numbers going down. We may hear the doctors say, we've done all that we can do. We may accept that intellectually, but with our heart, we're not, because there's always the hope that there's another pill, there's another medicine, there's another surgery, there's another procedure, because we're all about living. But that's one way in terms of dealing with an anticipated loss. With a sudden loss, and we looked at that briefly last night, but if you have those notes with you, I want us to look back at a few things in regards to that, because with a sudden loss, where there is no forewarning, there is no knowledge, there's just the idea that I last saw them an hours ago or this morning or whatever the case may be, and you're telling me that they have died. This leaves us with a sense of unreality that lasts for a long time. Some of the words that people in shock may feel are dazed, confused, bewildered, panicky. One person said foggy. Hard to think about what you're saying. I'm trying to assimilate those words. They have died. Because last time you saw them, maybe everything was good and everything was fine, and they were talking about different things. Off-center, one person put it. They felt off-centered because of the news that was given. Treading water, out of sync. A fellow told me recently in our church, his wife had died suddenly of a heart attack in the bed at nighttime. Woke up and, she was dead. And he said shortly after that, some weeks after that, would have been their 50-something anniversary. And he said, Don, can you imagine that people on that day were telling me happy anniversary? And he said, that just hurt me that much more, because how can it be a happy anniversary because my husband or my wife is not here beside me of whatever years? Sometimes without meaning to, we say the wrong things. And that's why I keep on saying, it's not what you say, it's what you do that really, really makes a difference in the lives of people. Sometimes with sudden loss, there is that sense of guilt, the what ifs or the if onlys. And it's going to take a while to work through those, because something that should not have happened has happened. This person has died. Yes, we may understand that the trauma of a car accident can take someone's life or something of that nature, but still, what if he had stayed a little bit longer at our house? That wreck wouldn't have occurred, or whatever the case may be. And those are things that people have to go through. As I said last night, it's going to take longer to work through a sudden, unanticipated loss, because there's more questions and less answers. And that's why you need to be good to yourself, but not only that, the church family and others need to be aware of that person and where they're coming from in regards to church attendance, in regards to what they're saying, in regards to their feelings, because they're still just trying to tread water. They're just trying to get through it. And it's really, really, really hard. There's no script for this. And so we need to understand that. There's often a sense of helplessness. Dolores Cooning put it this way: the impact of sudden death is devastating, for it happens without warning or a chance to anticipate what lies ahead. It allows no time for goodbyes, no time to make amends or to ask forgiveness for harsh words spoken in trivial quarrels, and no time to express the love one feels but does not verbalize. The unfinished business of the day can never be transacted. It remains unresolved. It's like an unfinished song. The melody stops in mid-phrase that longs for completion. That's why it's so important to try to say the things that we mean to say ahead of time. It's really important to do that. There's also sometimes that regret and a sense of unfinished business. Men especially are of this nature. They want to know why. They may spend a great deal of time talking to doctors, or talking to the hospital, or talking to the police, or talking to paramedics, trying to piece together the things that took place immediately after that accident or whatever the case may be. Men are about fixing things, and this is something that cannot be fixed, and that's really, really hard to deal with. And so that often is really important. Sometimes the sudden nature of a loss can cause a sense of insecurity. Especially with children, there's that idea that if something happened and someone died unexpectedly, then it can happen to them, or it can happen to all their other loved ones. I remember years ago, this patriarch in Guin, Alabama, where I was the preacher, had passed away. And so they called me. I went to visit with the family. It was around the time in which the kids were coming home from school. I offered to go pick up this man's grandchildren from school. They said, sure. And so I had picked them up, and they knew about Papa who had passed away. And the youngest grandchild was beside me in the car, sitting there in the seat. And he said, well, Papa has died, and Mama, she's not doing too well, and she's probably going to die. And I said, she's in pretty good health. Yeah, but she's going to die, and then Mama and Daddy, they're probably, he had everybody dead in about 5 minutes' time, bless his heart, a little 6-year-old. But because to him it had happened suddenly, even though the demise had been going on for some time, he was afraid that it was going to touch him and his family And that's very, very, very true, especially with children. And so what can we do to try to help them? One thing that we can certainly try to do to help folks who have lost sudden, unexpected losses is to be careful not to tell our own stories to them at that time. They do not need to hear your stories, however sad they may be, of a sudden loss, because they're trying to deal with theirs. Brent, you tell me that I'm wrong with this, but have you at the funeral home with the family standing there the night of the visitation, and you're standing there near to those parents and their loved ones in the casket, have you not heard many times others tell their grief stories at that time? I call it piling on. They don't need to hear your story. Yes, there is a time in which maybe there's some commonalities of your unexpected loss and of their unexpected loss, but don't take the limelight off them. They need your care, your concern, but they've got enough grief. They don't need to hear yours. Again, I'm not saying there's not a time, but that's not the time. I hope you understand where I'm coming from in that manner. Avoid platitudes, cliches, and trite expressions. Sometimes people will say, "You seem so strong." Well, again, you may have not seen them 30 minutes ago when they cried off all their makeup and they just put it back on again. You don't understand what happened out in the parking lot when they just had a shout out with somebody because of all the feelings and the emotions. And sometimes the idea is that those that seem so strong may still be in shock because they're just trying to get through this the very best that they can. And so we need to be careful that we don't make those, God only gives us what we can deal with. That's just not the time, because they're just really trying to understand this. Yes, there's a place for God, and there's a place to talk about those things, but in those immediate moments, that's really, really important. And then it's really important to understand during sudden loss the forgotten grievers. The forgotten grievers may be children or grandchildren, but let's imagine that this person that died had stepchildren. And I've heard this, that they weren't acknowledged, that, they may not even be standing up there with the family at the visitation, and yet this was the only dad that they ever had. And yet some people, well-meaning, may forget that they too are hurting, or in-laws, or other people, or maybe even associates at work. Here was someone that maybe was the head of a company and he dies real suddenly. Think about all the people. I've sometimes gone to places and talked to the fellow workers, especially if there was a sudden unanticipated loss, because that's an impact on them. Not only was he the boss, but he was the one that got them started in the business. He was the one that told the jokes. He was the one that bought the meals when they all got together. He was the one, over and over and over again. They're hurting. And yet sometimes their grief is not acknowledged in that manner. They need to talk about their story, and they need to tell that story over and over again. Sometimes with sudden unanticipated losses, telling their story, I'm talking about how it happened, all the things that went along with it, helps to validate that it really did happen. They need to hear their voice telling that story, because sometimes they may wake up and think this didn't happen. Sometimes that's the case. And so validating by them telling that story, and they may tell the same story here at church over and over to you as elders. Just be gracious and listen, and just tell them that you're praying for them, and look for ways that can be helpful. We didn't get to finish that last night, so I wanted to go back for that just for a moment. Are there any questions about that or anything else before we go on to number 7? Okay. An adult will not be affected much if their parent dies. True or false? False. Doesn't matter. You're looking at the 66-year-old baby of Joe and Dot Williams. I'm a twin, and so somebody says, well, why is Ron bigger than you? I said, well, he should be. He's 5 minutes older. Some of you know Ron. But it doesn't matter. When Ron and I would do grief workshops, invariably after we had left, the first person we would call would be Mom and Dad and tell them who we saw, who knows them, where we went, and all the good things. And we were coming back from Benton, Kentucky last Sunday night, and we just said, we can't call Dad. And I said, yep, that makes it sad, because it doesn't matter. What roles does a parent play in the life of a child? Name some of them. What's a parent to a child? A security, a rock, a hero. What else? I'm sorry? Yes. A cheerleader. They're there for all your first. They're there to see you graduate from kindergarten. They didn't have those in my day. Yours probably also. But, for your high school and your college graduation and your weddings, and then, the birth of their first grandchild. Somebody said the greatest sight of grandparents is the headlights of the car bringing the grandchildren to their home. The second greatest sight is the taillights of those cars 3 days later as they leave. We have some in Kentucky and some in Huntsville. And so we just wear ourselves out. And when they typically would leave on a Sunday afternoon about 1:30, we go take a nap. But it's a good time. Yes, they're there for your first. And so parents, certainly, it doesn't matter how old you are or how old they are, it's certainly going to impact you. Number 8, your grief journey will consist of neat stages of feelings and emotions that come in orderly and structured ways. Very false. This is the page that I think I showed you last night. And Brent, what's at the center of that? Denial. Denial is very much a part of it. Here's your homework. Sometime in the throes of your own home, the quietness of it, in your grief journey, look at that and circle the ones, don't turn this in, it's just for you. Circle the ones that you're presently in now. Maybe put a date beside it. And then come back several weeks later and say, okay, I'm no longer in that, but now I'm feeling this. And chart yourself. A lot of times after my 10-week class that I would do for the last 30 years, sometimes people would say, thank you for letting me know I'm not losing my mind, because you're just going through grief. Again, there's not stages. There's emotions, there's feelings. And so it's not anything clean and structured. Number 9, the words I know how you feel can be of great comfort in time of loss. Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
The one thing on that chart that I don't see are any positive emotions.
Thank you. That's a good point.
And in grief, there are, at times, positive emotions.
Good point. Somebody else put that together. You're exactly right. But somebody else recently pointed out and said, there's nothing positive on here. And I said, yes, there are positive emotions that are not found on this, because there can be blessing, there can be appreciation, there can be continued everlasting love that we have. There can be hope, all those good things. That's a good point. Maybe we need to redo one and have this is part 1 and here's a part 2, what you're trying to get through. But thank you for pointing that out, because you're exactly right. The words I know how you feel. Can there be a great comfort in time of loss? I've had too many people. I'm not going to name her name because some of you might know her, but she had the loss of 2 husbands. The first one over a anticipated cancer situation, And then the second minister that she married died with a heart attack when they were vacationing in Gulf Shores, Alabama. And she came to my grief class and she said, when people say to me at church services, I know just how you feel. She said, I just want to poke them. I said, I'd called her by name. I said, I'm sure glad that you're not doing that. I said, I can just see it. Preacher's wife lays out somebody in the church foyer. But she said, this made her mad because you don't know how they feel. Even if you're the same age, even if you lost your loved one with the exact same manner, you're different people. You know, here may be a person that retired early in life and for the last 20 plus years has been with his wife every day. Contrast to another man that, worked a long, long time and they, were always together, but he was at work. And so the relationship would be completely different. And so those words, you can say, I can only imagine what you're feeling, or I cannot imagine what you're feeling. I said that to someone recently who lost a little baby in a car accident because I don't know. And we wouldn't choose to know, but those words don't help. Again, the lady that I thought was so in tune with this would say, I say to the family, I don't know how you're feeling, but can I give you a hug? Because that lets them know that you do care. But those words cannot help you according to what others said. Number 10, disenfranchised grief suggests a loss that either is not publicly recognized due to the relationship or loss that is not publicly accepted. That's true. If you want to do some more research on that, Kenneth Doka, D-O-K-A, came up with that concept about 1989. It's losses that we don't readily understand. COVID certainly was a disenfranchised kind of grief. Because in those first months, sadly, there were people that were dying, and because of all the limitations about funerals, you didn't even know about it until after they were in the ground. I mean, seriously, that was really, you couldn't acknowledge because you didn't know. And even if you knew, you couldn't go, in some cases. I don't know how it was here, but there in Northwest in Alabama, 10 people tops could go to a funeral. It had to be outside. You could not touch the deceased. No one, if some people wanted to go and be there, they had to be in their cars and wait till the funeral home had left before they went to the cemetery to be with the family. Those were the limitations that, they had put on people. And so that was a disenfranchised loss. You couldn't publicly acknowledge it because of the situation itself. Or what about somebody at work that says to you, well, my stepdad died. And you said, well, I'm sorry. And what they don't realize is he was the only dad you ever knew. And they don't understand why you're grieving so hard, but that man really came to your life and your mom's life at a time that was so important, and yet they don't understand that. Or what about somebody that has a physical ailment of some kind? Here in Alabama, there was Coach Gene Stallings. Many of you know him, recognize him. You also remember John Mark, their adult son that had Down syndrome, died at the age of 46, long after they thought that he was going to be dying sooner than that. Imagine somebody saying to Gene and Ruth Ann Stallings, well, I know you did really the best for him, but now you can move on. Excuse me? It didn't matter how many chromosomes he did or did not have. That was our child conceived in love, and you're not going to take away our grief from it. Those are disenfranchised losses. A suicide is a disenfranchised loss in the sense that people sometimes don't understand all that goes with it, and sometimes they will say hurtful things, and that's really, really sad to do. And we need to be very, very careful of people and their families. There's always innocent family members that are hurting in situations like that. And so we need to treat them with love and care and concern. Number 11, lengthy chronic illnesses such as Alzheimer's prepare their survivors and prevent complications at the time of loss. I've had too many people tell me it didn't matter how long they had that disease. When they died, I was a complete shock. Why? Because the battle of the heart versus the head. Yes, we may see the demise, but we're always thinking that there's something else that can be better. And so whether it's dementia or whether it's something else, just being there for the journey doesn't get you ready for the end of it. And so that's important to understand. Then finally, number 12, and then we'll take a break after this. Time heals all wounds is true even with a wound of grief. It's what you do with your time. Come to support groups like this. Read good books. Have a church family that's there to insulate you with love and concern. One person put it, you can stop the bleeding, but you can't cover the scars. Another person said trying to deal with grief is like trying to cover up cancer with a Band-Aid. You can't cover up cancer with a Band-Aid. You've got to work through your grief. You've got to go through your grief. You've got to grow through your grief. And that's so, so very important. We're about to take a break, but perhaps there's a question or a comment that you would like to make before we do so. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Let's take about a 10-minute break. And